Wow, it is an honor to be here with so many of the people who I've interviewed, read their books, and studied for the last several years, and to finally be able to make it out to a Superpod. I wanted to quickly ask one question. Show of hands, how many of you have heard of Moby? Because I realize this is probably like the best informed audience I'm ever gonna get. How many of you were actually at the Moby Symposium half a dozen years ago? I know Ken was there, but anybody else? Oh, okay. Seeing a couple of hands. So, for those of you who don't know Moby, basically, this would be the prequel to Blackfish. So, this is the story that set captivity in motion, and I'm gonna take you all back 54 years ago in 2 days. July 16th, 1964. 13 killer whales break through the pristine water off Saturna Island to take a breath under the morning sun. Their jet black dorsal fins slice through the surf off Canada's west coast, and Joe Bauer can't believe what he's seeing. 2 months. The fisherman has waited 2 months for this moment, and now, just as he's packing up camp, the day after the mission has been abandoned, a pod has appeared, and the whales are swimming toward the shoreline. "Whale!" shouts Bauer. When Samuel Burrich hears his friend, he can't believe it either, doesn't even glance up as he yells, "Bullshit." Then he looks out at the ocean. Burrich has been commissioned to craft an anatomically accurate, life-size facsimile of the ocean's apex predator for the Vancouver Aquarium. The sculpture of the creature known as the fiercest, most unpredictable killer on the planet will be the aquarium's centerpiece. Now, after 8 weeks of watching, waiting, and dreaming, a killer whale is in sight. There's only one thing Burrich needs to do with the whale that will be the inspiration for his art: kill it. Burrich takes his place behind an antique muzzle-loaded Norwegian harpoon gun and lines up his target. The bigger whales seem to sense trouble and swim back out to sea. But the smallest one looks Burrich right in the eye. Burrich stares back at his prey and gauges the distance. It's no more than 90 feet away. His gun's range is 100. He braces for the recoil from the gunpowder charge and fires. A 4-foot-long, 2-inch thick steel bolt flies over the ocean. A 600-foot line of rope holding 3 bright orange buoys known as Scotchmen trails in the sky like a kite tail, and nothing. The small whale leaps and vanishes under the ocean as if taunting the would-be whaler. Burrich is devastated. The mission is over. He'll never be able to retrieve the harpoon line in time to prepare a second shot before the pod swims away. Bauer, who's taking photos from the bluff below, has a better view through his camera lens. Burrich has harpooned a whale. The spear pierced the skin just behind the skull and hooked the killer like a giant bait fish the men could use to catch a bigger whale. And if they had another harpoon ready, Burrich might take aim at one of the larger killers diving toward their catch. Their ears still ringing from the blast, Burrich and Bauer race toward their boat. Burrich has a rifle to finish the job and for self-defense, in case the other bloodthirsty creatures want vengeance. Everyone knows these are the planet's most dangerous beasts, the only animal besides man that seems to kill for sport, a whale that will rip other whales to shreds. As Burrich and Bauer chase their victim, 2 larger whales burst through the water. The vicious killers are doing something unthinkable. They are carefully holding the smaller whale aloft. It's unconscious, possibly dead. This isn't an attack. It's a rescue. What kind of monsters are these? So I didn't come at orcas through science. When I started working on orcas, I could actually envision my high school science teachers rolling in their graves. And I don't know if they were dead before I started writing about whales, but the idea that I'd be writing a book that won Best Science Book in Canada would have killed them. So I came at this because in 1996, I was doing a story on cetaceans in captivity at the Vancouver Aquarium for Maclean's magazine. Since most of you are American, I'll translate. Maclean's was Canada's Time magazine or Newsweek. So I decided I wanted to interview the best person available who could give me the single best quote on whale rights. So I called Paul Watson. And Paul Watson and I are talking. We're talking about the Vancouver Aquarium. And he says, and you know, the Vancouver Aquarium is the first place that had ever captured a killer whale and displayed it. I'm like, how in the world do I not know this? I live a few miles from the Vancouver Aquarium. How do I not know this piece of history? And then Watson says, yeah, and they harpooned it. I'm thinking, what kind of monster harpoons a whale? I couldn't wrap my head around it. I'm from the era where whales are lovable. Sure, they're in tanks, but they're smart and lovable. So I can't even imagine the idea of harpooning a whale. So I decided I have to get to the bottom of this story. And I'm going to write this. And I did two things freelance journalists never do. Okay, the first is I decided that this story of this whale Moby wasn't for Maclean's magazine, it was for me. Normally, first rule of thumb as a journalist is the most interesting thing you hear isn't just in the story, it's the top of the story. For some reason, I didn't think Maclean's needed to hear about this. I wanted to know more about it. The other thing I decided to do, which is its own hazard as a freelancer, is I was going to do this story and not sell it first. I wasn't going to see if anybody wanted this story. I wanted this story. I had to find out more about it. So I went and tracked down the guy who ran the Vancouver Aquarium back when this happened, the guy whose idea it was to harpoon a whale, Dr. Murray Newman. And I could not wrap my head around this. And when I went to meet Dr. Newman in his house, he'd been retired for years, he was about 71 years old. And when I said, why in the world would you harpoon a whale to study it? First thing he does is reads me this. So this is from the reigning textbook, or one of the reigning books on whales in 1963, the year before the expedition. And it's a book called Killer Whale, with a big exclamation mark, just so you know they're scary. And the introduction is written by Dr. Ross Negrelli, who was the pathologist at the New York Aquarium. And he wrote, "The fiercest, most terrifying animal in all the world lives in the sea, not on land. Lions, tigers, and great bears are considered savage animals, but many times more powerful and far more vicious than any of these is the killer whale." Okay, that was a surprise. I'm coming from an era where I can't believe anybody doesn't love whales, and this is what he's sending me back to 1963. The book concludes with a chapter titled A Living Nightmare. According to this true story, 5 men harpooned what they thought was a shark, but no, they realized it was a deadly orca. For the first time, he saw the animal's evil eyes. All at once, he knew that a dreaded killer whale was within touching distance. Shockingly, the people survived to tell this horrid tale. US Navy diving manuals at the time warned that if you saw an orca in the water, you had to get out of the water immediately because they were ferocious and would attack humans at any opportunity. I start digging into this. I discover a story in Time magazine about the Icelandic government approaching the US military who was stationed there. And they brought them out to help out with their orca problem because these horrible monstrous orcas were eating their nice, very, very important herring. This year, the largest pack of killer whales in living memory terrorized the seas off Iceland. This is Time magazine. They destroyed thousands of dollars worth of fishing tackle, forced dozens of Icelanders out of work for lack of gear. Last week, the Icelandic government appealed to the US, which has thousands of men stationed at a lonely NATO airbase on the subarctic island. 79 bored GIs responded with enthusiasm. Armed with rifles and machine guns, one posse of Americans climbed into 4 small boats, put to sea, and in one morning, wiped out a pack of 100 killers. A newsman watched an even bigger skirmish off Grindavik and related, killers were rounded up in a tight formation with concentrated machine gun fire, then moved out again one by one for the final blast, which would kill them. Other whales helped the troops, for as one was wounded, the other would set upon it and tear it to pieces with their jagged teeth. The sea was red with blood. The scene of destruction was terrible. I have never seen anything like it. Ken Balcom, when I interviewed him, told me about both the US and Canadian military using orcas here for target practice. In British Columbia, when fishermen in Campbell River and more importantly, tourists visiting Campbell River complained about the orca problem, they decided how to fix it. What was great was digging into the history of this, which basically came down to first bombs. They discussed bombs. They thought bombs might be a little much. So they settled on a more humane option than bombs. They were going to use a machine gun and set up a machine gun off the coast of Campbell River so that when the orcas showed up, they would take them out. And what was wild reading their discussions at the time was they were all convinced all they really needed to do was wound a few whales because whales were bloodthirsty monsters who would rip each other to shreds. And suddenly I realized when I was going to look into the story of Moby I had to get into the mindset of 1964 and figure out what was going on then. So the plan was, after Murray Newman talked to every orca expert he could find, he was told that absolutely bar none, the only way to display a killer whale was dead. So he wanted to put up the first ever anatomically accurate scale model of an orca. So he puts together a team. He gets a fisherman, Sam Burrich, who's also a renowned sculptor. He gets a bunch of other people to show up. They set up camp on Saturna Island. Here's where one of the things that I've started to discover where orcas are amazing and why I'm not remotely surprised the orcas are here for Superpod. When that machine gun went up at Campbell River, the orcas freaking vanished that summer. They went away. First day the machine gun is set up on Saturna Island, orcas pass by just out 100 feet, just past the range of that harpoon gun. Now, they were keeping track of orca behavior visiting Saturna, and basically it was rare for a day to go by without a pod passing by. From the day that the harpoon was set up off East Point on Saturna Island, to the day they were taking it down, the orcas vanished, as if there was a giant keep out sign hidden in the water. It was astonishing. So what happened was they decided they were going to cancel this expedition because it was turning into a snipe hunt. And then the whales showed up, the part that I just read you. And here's where things get crazy. First, the big pivotal change moment in the entire story really was these guys witnessing the 2 other orcas not doing what they believed they would do. When those 2 orcas came to Moby rescue, the 2 hunters were not loving their job anymore. They were also, however, scared to death of orcas, or at least one of them, Sam Burrich, was. And he had that rifle to finish the job, got on his boat and took 3 shots at Moby at the whale who became known as Moby When the whale didn't die, Joe Bauer got in a skiff and went out to check out the condition of the orca. And What he saw was a whale who had been hooked and was not dying, and he called out and said that Vancouver Aquarium could have a live whale if they wanted it. So they called back to Dr. Murray Newman, who was running the expedition, and a guy named Dr. Pat McGeer, who's a familiar name in BC, fascinating character. He was a government minister. He was also one of the top neuroscientists in the world. At 91, he just patented a cancer treatment last week. So he's still alive, active, and doing a ton of work, mostly on concussions right now. And he wanted to study this whale's brain. McGeer and Newman show up and basically decide they're going to try and take the whale back to Vancouver. But one other thing happens before this that I want to mention, because this is one of the other chefs, and it was something I didn't believe when I first heard it, which was Joe Bauer, when he went out to see the whale, sees that all these guys on Saturna Island have shown up with their .303 rifles. And they are trying to help the Vancouver Aquarium finish the job that they started. So they are firing at the whale. And Bauer puts himself on the skiff between the guys with the rifles and the whale. And the people from shore start screaming at him. And Sam Burrich says, "You're gonna die." Now, I thought this story was completely implausible. And like I said, my background's journalism. I come from, a history of a tradition where it's like, if your mom tells you it's sunny outside, you're still supposed to check out the window and fact check. So when Joe Bauer told me this story, I had my doubts. And then I saw some old archival footage, and sure enough, there's Joe on the skiff. I started finding old photos, and there's Joe on the skiff. And when I was on Saturna Island doing research, all the guys said, no, there were no rifles. None of us carried rifles. No one did that. And then I checked, I had a researcher working with me, and her job was to read every single newspaper, every single daily newspaper from BC for the month before Moby was caught, the month after Moby was released. A month after Moby died. And she found an article where Sam Burrich was interviewed very early on, talking about all the islanders showing up with their rifles. So, yeah. So Joe Bauer went out and did that. Then they decided they had to get the whale back to Vancouver. How do you do that? So the whale's at the other end of the harpoon line. And this was the other interesting conversation that I had with Joe about this. If you were at the symposium, you would know that the one person who didn't show up was Joe Bauer. And he didn't show at the last moment, and I asked him why. And it seemed to come down almost entirely to the use of one word. And it's one word that everybody uses to describe Moby being brought in, unless they use something harsher, which is towed. And Murray Newman says the whale was towed in his book. And Pat McGeer said the whale is towed in his book. And Joe Bauer, who was a fisherman, said no, towing would have meant resistance. Towing would have ripped the line out. Towing would have killed the whale. He said, we had to lead the whale. And that's the reason it took 19 hours to do a very short trip from Saturna to Vancouver, because they had to move with the whale. And it was interesting because I wondered about his fussiness over the use of this word. And again, if you read interviews with Samuel Burrich at the time, he is proud of the fact that he harpooned the whale. He has no trouble telling everybody that he shot the whale 3 times, although we found out later he missed all 3 times. He was that scared, he was that close, and he missed all 3 times. But when somebody says, and you towed the whale, he was absolutely not. So, just putting that out there. They took the whale back to Vancouver because the plan was to display Moby as a sculpture on the roof of the aquarium, or on the ceiling of the aquarium. There was nowhere to set up. So they phoned Vancouver Dry Dock and took the whale to a dry dock. And that's when everything turned into a circus. Moby was put on display for exactly 1 day by the dry dock. I now know this was kind of a publicity stunt to get people behind the whale. And then Moby was moved and was described as the weirdest, pretty much the wildest moving job ever, because they took the Canadian military, put together a makeshift pen at Jericho Beach, which is a few miles away from the dry dock, and then they took the dry dock over. Now, from the moment Moby arrived, what was fascinating was the level of fear they still had, with the exception of really Bauer. Everybody seemed scared to death that the whale was going to come back to its senses at any moment, that Moby was going to, and I'm using the word it because they saw that whale as an it. So the whale was going to come back to its senses at any moment and attack them. So when they wanted to give Moby penicillin, they used an actual 10-foot pole and put the penicillin on top of the pole because they were that scared to get anywhere near it. At any moment, they were sure this was going to happen. It was interesting. One of the things that Murray Newman told me was, he said, you know, if we caught a lion or a tiger or a bear, it would attack at any moment. There'd been a hunt for orcas from a U.S. Marine park. They'd sent out a captive team to pretty much out here. And when the whales lined up in formation, they decided they were attacking. When one of the whales chased a porpoise, the brave whale hunters were so sure they were in trouble that they broke out a gun and shot the whale 10 times. So that was the knowledge they were working from the aquarium when they caught Moby. Now, I've got no idea how long I'm going for time because I can't check my time, so I want to skip on to a few other things and I'll happily answer anything after. But I know you guys are going on for time. So that's what I thought. So now, here's the wild part. I didn't call this the killer whale who changed the world because Moby started captivity. That wasn't the only hook for me. The other hook for me was when I started researching this story, discovering that pretty much everything that we ever found out about orcas in the early days came out of Moby Doll. When Moby Doll refused to eat, and Moby did not eat for a very long time, Dr. Pat McGarrett called in a UBC student named Dr. Michael Bigg. Bigg was studying pinnipeds, meets Moby Doll, and decides that whales are kind of interesting. Goes on to discover that whales are so interesting that there are different ecotypes, or really different species of whales. So he was the one who came up with the numbering system. The reason we know J-pod, K-pod, L-pod all comes out of Michael Bigg. One of the people who saw Moby Doll that one day Moby was on display was a 9-year-old boy named John Ford. In this room I can go, yeah, that John Ford. So John Ford watches the whale, sees Moby, feels quite sorry for Moby, ends up volunteering at the Vancouver Aquarium, working with Dr. Michael Bigg and coming up with a theory that different orcas have different dialects, and proves that theory the first time he hears J-pod, because he's memorized Moby Doll's calls. And the capper for me was when I interviewed Paul Watson, I thought, is it a coincidence that the first place that caught a killer whale was also the place that launched Greenpeace and really the Sea Shepherd, because Watson, Vancouver, out of Greenpeace. And nobody seemed to have an answer to that until I interviewed Paul Spong. And Paul Spong was the person who convinced Greenpeace to switch from their anti-nuke agenda to saving the whales. So he came up with the idea that that was the cause they should get behind. And so there's a question that I've been asking everybody because the answer is always amazing. But this one was the most amazing answer I ever got. When we started filming the movie about Moby Doll, I asked Paul Spong the first time he saw a whale. And he said the first time he saw a whale was Moby Doll's brain. And he saw Moby Doll's brain, was blown away, and could not believe that the brain was more complicated than ours, and wondered, what is that whale thinking with that brain? He then went on to work with Scanna, decided whales had a sense of humor, and whales had no business in tanks. So Spong went on to form Greenpeace. So I didn't mean to see that. No. Spawn went on to work with Greenpeace, get them to save the whales. And I wanted to end off with one quick thing here. Now, I'm writing a kid's book about orcas, and there was one term I really wanted to get into with the kids. Anthropomorphizing means thinking a god, animal, or object are doing or experiencing something the way we do. So suggesting a whale can grieve or celebrate love, suggesting a whale can grieve or celebrate or love is anthropomorphizing. This is considered extremely unscientific among most scientists, and when a scientist says someone is anthropomorphizing, they're almost always dissing them. Giving an animal a human name is considered anthropomorphizing or humanizing. It is also a key to getting humans to care about animals, since people are more likely to fall in love with Granny and Onyx than J2 and L87, and a lion named Cecil than a lion. I anthropomorphize a lot. I believe orcas grieve and celebrate and love, or something similar enough that we shouldn't have to make up new words to make their experiences seem alien. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the Southern residents showed up for Superpod 6. I think anyone who doesn't believe animals have feelings, emotions, or intelligence is suffering from anthropo-denial. Anthropo-denial is a fairly new idea. It means that anyone who doesn't believe animals have feelings, emotions, or intelligence isn't paying attention. The word was created by Franz de Waal, a scientist studying monkeys. He described it as a blindness to the human-like characteristics of other animals or the animal-like characteristics of ourselves. This is a form of reality blindness that does not seem to affect any indigenous cultures anywhere. The Lumi Nation sees the orcas as our relations who live underwater. Aboriginal cultures around the world consider orcas relatives or reincarnations of relatives. And who do you think is more likely to treat orcas better? People who see orcas as aliens from the oceans, or people who see them as family?
Amen.